I feel obliged to say, since we're in India, that the idea of Chet, the dissenter in Sanskrit commentary, is so central to the progress of thought, and there's an obligation on the commentator, as he's discussing an idea, for there to be an interjection and for there to be this counter-argument, which is the sort of basis of thought. And if the person who objects doesn't provide a valid argument, the commentator himself steps in and provides a fair defense to the other person, just because of the sake that the integrity of thought should not be damaged. So we have a very ancient system. The gentleman from the RSS earlier was talking about dialogue, and this has been actually the foundation of Indian dialogue. The gentleman, my co-panelists, had been talking a lot about political dissent. The kind of dissent that interests me, or the lines of dissent that interest me, are lines of cultural dissent. I grew up in this country, and I grew up in a very strange way as a colonized person. I was part of that class which the British administrator Macaulay had tried to create in the 1830s, men who would act as intermediaries between us and the millions whom we govern, Indian in blood, English, and now increasingly American in tastes and intellect. Macaulay was roughly my age, 34, when he was appointed president of the Committee of Public Instruction, and he knew that he could never educate the whole body of the people. His plan was to create a class that would gradually extend modern knowledge to the great mass of the population. But in the India that I grew up in, this was not what happened. What happened instead was that this class grew more isolated with every generation, more deracinated. Gandhi described them at the opening of BHU in 1916 as foreigners in their own land. At the time of independence, when an old Indian culture was being reborn as a modern nation, and Amit Shah gestured to this moment as well, there was an instance when this imbalance could have been corrected. It might have been possible to profoundly reform the system of education the British had bequeathed us, and which had been born out of a contempt of Indian learning and antiquity, and for there to be a new kind of education that would take seriously Indian learning and that would in some ways integrate this birth of a modern nation with the ancient culture that had come along. The opportunity was not taken, and India's elite, the establishment, so to speak, continued to be culturally and linguistically denuded. In my grandfather's generation, there had been a kind of cultural bilinguality. I, out of a private effort, had tried to regain Urdu and Sanskrit, but the knowledge of languages for me would forever be incomplete. And I grew up as many people in India, as a sort of Indian with Amit Shah yesterday had spoken of antrik Shakti, of inner vitality, of inner strength. And we were a class of people who borrowed our strength from, which was a kind of extension of the power of Europe and America. And it was not a vital country. It was not a vital class of people, but we were surrounded by a very vital country. I find it's very important for me to try to capture the strangeness of this experience, because I have a picture, for instance, of myself aged 18 on a trip to Varanasi, and I'd been sent there by my mother just before I was going to college, and she was afraid that maybe I would become more culturally alienated. And I'm sitting there on the riverfront dressed in like a flimsy black and white shirt with ohms on it, and I'm wearing baggy pants and sandals. And what's clear from this picture is that I've understood my mother's desire for me to go to Varanasi as a kind of encouragement to adopt a fancy dress. I'm a Western traveler, a kind of modern-day hippie in search of secret India. And as a friend of mine says in New York, she's like, it's that Indian need to self-orientalize. And really the analog would be a Frenchman who's lived in France all his life, but hardly knows any French. He doesn't know Molière or Racine or Balzac. He's never visited the great sites of France. Then aged 18, his mother decides, just as he's going off to college abroad, that it's a disgrace how little he knows about his culture. And she kind of wants him to make a pilgrimage, a sort of internal grand tour of a kind. And so what he does is that he goes down to the nearest tourist shop and he buys a Paris Je t'aime t-shirt and puts on a Georgia Tech baseball cap and New Balance sneakers, straps on a belt around his belt and a money belt, and kind of goes off to see the great sights of France. And it was to me like a kind of strange self-image, because I was confronted with the fact that the British colonization of India was nothing compared in scale or vehemence with the colonization India had made of herself after the British left. It has pursued the aims of the colonizers with a dedication that probably would have surprised Macaulay. And the result is a ruling class that is hardwired to reject India. It would be the equivalent of an elite in Europe and America that was systematically steered away from all aspects of European culture, language, art, and literature, bred in the bone to turn their nose up in distaste at the mere mention of Homer or Dante or Shakespeare. And in those first moments when I started to go to Benares, and I was 18 and visited it seriously, and I came across, for instance, an entire discussion that was being conducted in Sanskrit on sphota, it's a science to do with the relationship between sound and meaning, and sphota, they're like word seeds. And it just, as I sat there, unable to understand a single word of what I was listening to, I thought it's so strange that I, who am intellectually inclined, who've grown up in this country, that none of this should have even been open to me to reject. It was as if a pathway had been created where I would never even see what there was underlying. And actually, these kinds of cultural tensions are some of the things that really came to the fore during the Modi election. They were almost dramatized by that election. And as I traveled among people in India, I felt that the whole intellectual enterprise in India had become suspect. It was as if Octavio Paz talks about this idea of ideas, or exalted ideas, secularism, liberalism, freedom of speech, being used in Mexico to maintain the power of an oligarchy, of a cultural oligarchy. And it was something very similar that had occurred in India. And what was very worrying to me on the other side was that though people were filled with a tremendous sense of pride and a tremendous sense that this must change, it was as if all they had in their hands was this pride, because they hadn't found a way for them to use what was a tremendous resource of cultural wealth in some kind of modern way. They hadn't, that second birth that had to occur hadn't occurred for them, and they were in some ways almost harmed by what they knew of India. And a student I was following very closely, a Sanskrit student who'd come out of Madhya Pradesh, and he'd come in that very old sense, and he'd come to Benares. He was a student of the Ved. And for him, political consciousness came in a very simple way. What he wanted to know was what would become of him. He who'd studied Sanskrit, he who'd lived as people for centuries had before. Was there any kind of real future for him in India? Was there a future for his language? And the question was deceptively simple, because what he was really asking was, what would India do with her past? Would she simply just shrug it aside? And for me, at least, the moment was a very delicate one, because the kind of break that had occurred in my life was occurring in the lives of other Indians too. They were also being culturally denuded, and in some ways, almost the pain of that, or the energy escaping that collapse of the old ways of tradition, was being channeled into a politics of religion, into a politics that had almost the force of faith, because I think I'd written in one of my books that when a culture dies, its slogans grow louder. And there was this, an acute sense of desperation that I felt very much needed an outlet. Because when you realize, when you actually travel in India, it's somewhat alarming to find that the world of tradition, when it's intact, has now receded very far. And at one point, I was sent to meet a man who was, he used to teach the Samved in the Samved Vidyalaya in Benares, and he was a man called Shastri, and he was completely embedded in the world of tradition. And when I asked him all these questions, or the things that we're talking about just now, it was as if he couldn't even understand what language I was speaking. The terms didn't make any sense to him. So finally, he kept talking about dharma, he kept talking about Kali Yuga, and he talked about the Ved. And so finally, I said to him, what is the value of teaching the Ved in a time like this, in a time of Kali Yuga? If this is dissolution, then why are you carrying on like that? So he said to me, "Aap jante hain ki bij raksha kya hai?" So I said, I knew what bij raksha meant, but he was speaking of it as a concept. And so I said, no, as a concept I don't. He said, jab sarab aati hai, jab kisan, he made a little pouch with his hand, he put the beej, वो बीज लेके वो पेड़ में रखता है, और जब पे सलाब उठती है तो फिर से खेती हो सकती है. And he said, this is what we do here, and this is all that can be done. Thank you very much.